Well, hello again, and welcome back for part 10 of the Penny Family History Slideshow. Once again, my name is David Penny. Where we left off last time was just nearing the end of World War II. The boys, Douglas, my dad, and Wayne, my uncle, they're growing up. They go to school, to high school, to university. My dad meets his future wife, Marianne, and Wayne, and marries her. And Wayne meets his future wife, Cynthia, and marries her as well. And we'll go right up to the closing of the Waubashene cottage and the purchase of the Leonard Lake cottage property and the building of the first property there. And we'll stop it there. So it should be a fun episode, lots of interesting photographs to show you. Before we get started, as always, you may pause if you wish. Get your beverage. I prefer single malt Scotch whiskey. And let's have a toast to the Penny family and to the successful execution of the Penny Family History Slide Show. Cheers. Well, before we get started, let's just quickly review the old family tree. Hi, here I am. I'm down here. This is me, David. Let me blow myself up a little bit, though. There we go, out of my little box down here. As I mentioned, when we left off last time, it was just the end of the Second World War, around 1945. The family had a cottage at Waubashene, and they were living in the city, quite well established. Jock and Ann, 71 and 77 in 1945, lived with Malcolm, who's Annie, who passed on, her son. Alex, over here, who's Allan's older brother. And Bessie, over here, who is my grandmother, Phyllis's sister, or half-sister anyways. And all of those guys were living at 367 Keewatin. Mal, though, at this time was drafted into the Canadian Forces and was stationed in Kingston, Ontario, doing training and executing training and taking training. Meanwhile, Allan and Phyllis and Doug and Wayne, and they were 35 and 36, the parents, and Doug was 14 and Wayne was 10. They were living at 214 Cranbrook Avenue, not far away from 367 Keewatin. Vera and Sewell Whaley were nearby as well. Vera was a half-sister, another half-sister of Phyllis. They were living at 17 Keewatin Avenue. And the eldest brother, Jim, who's at this point is 55 years old, he's in the Caribbean living with his wife, Winnie. He was soon to return to Toronto after the war. So we're going to take this all the way through out to 1956. And during that time, Doug meets and marries Marianne. And Wayne meets and marries Cynthia. And Cindy and Wayne have Susan by the end of this video. And of course, later on, they're to have Jenny, Stuart, and Debbie, and L'Oreal and David will come along as well. So let's have a look at where all of that takes us. Now, just to get a sense of the times, here's some photographs taken around the 1940s. Here's downtown Toronto looking up Bay Street towards Old City Hall. We saw a photo like this from the 1920s. The cars have modernized a bit. Here's a typical classroom in the 1940s in a Toronto primary school. Here's a high school phys ed class in the 1940s. And this gym looks very much like the Lawrence Park Collegiate Institute gym where I went to high school and where my dad went as well. But it may not be. And here is the intersection of Yonge and Eglinton. And the family lived very near here. This is North Toronto, and we lived up the street as well. This was in 1945, just the period we're starting at. And there is a family photo of Jock Penny looking very official. Looks like he's on government business. And during the war years, so still a wartime economy. Well, before the war is quite over, we have an addition to the family, little Bobbie, Robert John Penny, born April 4th, 1945, to Alex and Bessie. Uh, at the time, Alex was 49 and Bessie was 35. They were married February 1936, so this is now 9 years on from that, approximately. So I guess they'd been trying for a while, and they succeeded in having little Bobbie. And they live with Jock and Ann at 367 Keewatin. Finally, victory is declared. Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, May 8th, 1945. A very patriotic cover on the newspaper, and there were tremendous celebrations. These are all photos of celebrations in Toronto. So everyone was very joyful, and my dad and Uncle Wayne were both old enough to definitely remember this and take part in these celebrations, like those kids in the bottom right. The war wasn't quite over yet. There was still Japan who needed to be defeated, and VJ Day was soon after, August 15th, 1945. The population of Canada, just after the war, was about 12 million people. Now it's about 35 million. Of those 12 million, almost 10% served in uniform. 100,000 in the Navy, 250,000 in the Air Force, 500,000 in the Army, and 50,000 women served in Navy, Air Force, Army as nurses. 10,000 of those Canadians served in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and the rest Europe. 45,000 Canadians were killed altogether, and 55,000 wounded, so about 100,000 casualties. Peace at last is the headline. And the war ended in a terrible, terrible fashion with the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which over 100,000 Japanese civilians were killed in those atomic bombings. And that's what brought the war to the end. And of course, people are still debating whether that cost more lives or saved more lives ultimately. Well, here's, right at that time, here's Wayne Penny, Uncle Wayne, my Uncle Wayne, at age 10 with the Roberts boys at Waubashene. And in September of 1945, my father, Douglas Penny, enters what he called first form. It was known as first form at the time, which is grade 9, at Lawrence Park Collegiate Institute, which is our neighborhood high school. Now, LPCI was only founded in 1939, just at the start of the war. And so Douglas was actually the first post-wartime class to go into Lawrence Park only 6 years later. Now, he went there. He later on became a teacher, and he taught there. And I went there, and my sons went there. I met my wife, Kathleen. She went there as well. My sister, L'Oreal, she went there also. And her daughter, Julia. And my two sons, Kathleen and my two sons, Douglas and Brian, went there as well. So it's a bit of a family tradition, good old LPCI. Now, in 1946, I recall, little Bobbie had just been born, and so perhaps it was getting a little cramped in 367 Keewatin. But in 1946, Jock and Ann sell 367 Keewatin, and they moved to a small winterized cottage at Wilcox Lake. Now, Wilcox Lake, you can see on this map over here. This is Toronto down here, and this is where the family lived. So it's just a bit north, just past Richmond Hill. That little body of water there is called Wilcox Lake. And this cottage was on Wilcox Lake. That was probably initiated by Alex and Bessie buying a house at 42 Castlefield Avenue in North Toronto. So here's Castlefield, just to the west. This was 367 Keewatin over here. They moved just a few blocks west, and the rest of the family is more up here, over here. And Jock and Ann moved way, up north a bit. Photo from Christmas in 1946 showing the family. Over here is Uncle Mal. This is my Uncle Wayne. This is my dad, Douglas, Allan, Jock, and Phyllis with funny hats, which was for a long time a family tradition at Christmas, the funny hats. There's Douglas and Wayne. Douglas in his scouting uniform, and Douglas always had a book in his hand. He was always reading all manner of fact and fiction. He was a voracious reader. Wayne, not so much. He was more a athletic, outdoors, fun-loving type kid by all accounts. There's Allan and Phyllis at that same time as well. And here's the family in Waubashene in 1947. There's Wayne and Douglas at ages 11 and 16, and Phyllis and Allan. It's cute. Doug is holding Wayne's hand and vice versa. This kind of speaks to a relationship they had. There's Douglas around age 16 or 17 and 47 or 48. Now, while in high school, he went into the ravines in Toronto and collected specimens like moths and butterflies and field mice and things like that. And he worked with a network of various friends, including Leonard Willis and Bobbie Bateman. And the collection of field mice was really good, and they donated the collection to the Royal Ontario Museum. And in the old days, when the museum was still jam-packed with things, you could go to a certain room and you could pull open a certain drawer, and inside that drawer were a bunch of little tiny pinned field mice, which was my dad's collection, which he showed me when I was very young. They've since revamped the museum, and the vast majority of the collection is now no longer on display. They probably are still down there in the vaults somewhere. Robert Bateman, one of his friends he did this with, became quite famous as an artist. He was a nature painter. Those are some of his paintings on the right there. You can see he was born in Toronto in 1930. My dad was born in 31. He went to high school, and right around the same time my dad did, and graduated there at Forest Hill Collegiate, which was just up the road really from Lawrence Park. And he also went to the University of Toronto as well, like my dad did right at the same time. And he also got his teaching certificate at the Ontario College of Education as well, as my mom and my dad later did as well. And there's some pictures of him at the time. His other good friend was Leonard Willis, who just recently passed. Lionel was an amazing artist. These were some pages from his zoology notebook that he had, where they would dissect various things and draw pictures and label them as part of their coursework. So I have that book. I guess my dad borrowed it at some point to study from it. I just took a couple of those pages and scanned them in to show you what a brilliant artist he was. There's the obituary for Lionel. We knew Lionel quite a bit. He came around the house when I was a child. He was such an interesting man and such a wide array of knowledge. He went to Europe, where he met his wife and lived there as well. There's a Jock up at Wilcox Lake with the new Jip 2. My dad has labeled that dog as Jip 2. So I guess they weren't original with their dog names, and they named the second dog the same as the first. There's another one. Looks like a good dog. There's Anne at that same time at Wilcox Lake. As interested as I am in the family photos, I do not have whatever book she's looking at. I wonder where that got to. There's Jock again with Jip. And there's Anne once again, a very iconic picture of Anne at Wilcox Lake. Unfortunately, November 23rd, 1949, Anne passes at age 83 from complications due to a broken hip that she suffered while at Wilcox Lake. So that leaves Jock. Jock continues living at Wilcox Lake after Anne's passing. There's Douglas in his basement lab at 214 Cranbrook. At this point, he's in grade 12 in 1948. Quite the setup for the lab, wouldn't you say? There he is examining some specimens under his microscope. Again, yeah, I don't think my dad was a typical high school student. There he is. 1949. Now, Dad, he's probably looking at a book right then. As I say, he was a voracious reader. He rigged up a system in his favorite place to read on a couch, laying back on the couch reading. And the dog, of course, would want to go out and come back in again. So he rigged up a system of ropes and pulleys so he could just pull on the rope, and that would open the door and allow the dog to go out, and then pull it to close it up again, and he didn't have to get up. Now, in the summers of 1949, 1950, the end of, right towards the end of high school, he gets a job working in Algonquin Park at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Now, his mom, Phyllis, helps him get the job by approaching their very respected dentist, Dr. McGregor. My dad told me this story and how touched he was, because Phyllis was, a fairly self-effacing. She didn't go to university herself, or she wasn't a very highly educated woman, and she was very meek. A lovely, lovely person, but not one to yell or draw attention to herself in any way. But she plucked up her courage, and she approached Dr. McGregor and asked if he could help locate a job and write a letter of recommendation for Douglas, which he did do, and which was very instrumental in helping Douglas get that job. Dr. McGregor was actually my dentist. He was a very early pioneer in pediatric dentistry at Yonge and Lawrence. Set up practice there in the 40s, which is when Douglas was seeing him. He was the founding chief of dentistry at the Hospital of Sick Kids, and the first head of pediatric dentistry at the University of Toronto. So, very distinguished career. There's Douglas at Algonquin Park that summer. One of his jobs was painting lines across his chest, in vertical and horizontal lines, to designate certain regions, and he'd paint a number in the region. And then his job was to go out into the bush, and after putting various insect repellents on the various numbered squares on his body, he would sit there with a notepad and note how many insects and of what type landed and how many bit. What a job. He was a scientist at heart, and he never minded doing something for the greater good of science. He also mentioned one of his jobs was to catch various wildlife, such as fish and small animals, and to dissect them and look inside their guts and count the number of parasites and the types of parasites that were found there. There he is in Algonquin Park. And once again, and that looks to me to be like Booth Rock in Algonquin Park. I'm not 100% sure. His mom and dad came up to visit him and camp in Algonquin Park as well. And here they are. And there's Allan and Doug, I guess after having washed up. There's Allan. And here we are back in the cities, 1950. This is at 214 Cranbrook. I believe Uncle Mal lives here at 214 Cranbrook. I'm not 100% sure on that, but there's lots of photos of him in the house looking very much at home. So there's Allan and Phyllis, and there's Uncle Mal looking at that magazine. By this time, Uncle Mal has a job in sales, selling tires in the automotive department of Eaton's. So Eaton's is a big department store, and at that time, they had an automotive department. Mal spent his entire career at Eaton's. He eventually became a buyer there. Someone who would buy stuff wholesale and decide what to buy and negotiate for the prices in order to get it out onto the floors at Eaton's. And here's Allan around 1950. Allan eventually rose to become the foreman of the Bridges and Culverts gang of the CNR. Well, that's what he called it, the Bridges and Culverts gang. I'm sure it had a more official name. And here he is, and it looks as if he's putting up with no nonsense while he's supervising on the job. And after a hard day's work, well, you get a snooze, I guess. And there's Phyllis. Notice the old radio set over there, in this corner here. And this is apparently the famous red dress. And there is Mal on the front porch at 214 Cranbrook. Mal was a smoker his whole life, until late in life anyways. Mal had diabetes, or developed diabetes at some point as well. That probably led to his eventual death, where he had a stroke. There he is sitting in the backyard of 214 Cranbrook. That's the garage just to the right of the picture there, and they set up a little backyard patio there. And there's Mel with the ever-present cigarette in that same room with the radio. And there's Allan at 214 Cranbrook. He's doing a little bit of patching. Allan, one thing about my grandfather, he was always busy with something. His house on Fellbrook, which I knew very well, meticulously maintained shape. The basement was clean and painted to within an inch of its life. Every one of the pipes was painted with the appropriate kind of heat-resistant paint. So, beautiful red and blue pipes, and every aspect of that house was meticulously maintained by Allan. He absolutely kept it in fantastic shape. It was in his nature. There's Waubashene in the summer of 1950 with all the shutters propped open. And here they are having a bite at Waubashene inside. That's Phyllis way off to the left there, and Douglas and Allan. And here they are relaxing. There was no TV to watch, so they weren't watching TV, but maybe they were listening to the radio. Now, unfortunately, in April 27th, 1951, Alex dies at age 55. He leaves Janet Elizabeth Penny, maiden name Watts. That's Bessie, Aunt Bessie. And he leaves little Bobbie as well, who's age 6 at that time. I'll just skip a little bit ahead just to deal with that family. Only 6 years later, on June 13th, little Bobbie dies at age 12 of asphyxiation while asleep from an epileptic attack. Great tragedy for Aunt Bessie, losing both her husband and then her child, who they tried a long time to get. Aunt Bessie, though, takes it in stride and lives on to quite old age. So September 1950, and my dad, Douglas Penny, enters the University of Toronto, Victoria College, an honors science program, graduating in 1954 with an honors BA in physiology and biochemistry. And there he is there in 1951, age 20, just finished first year. And there's Wayne next to him. He's 16 in this photo. He just finished grade 11 at Lawrence Park Collegiate Institute. He has the LP Lawrence Park shirt on. Now in September 1953, Wayne graduates high school and enters the University of Western Ontario in London, which was the best school at the time for business type topics, business administration, which he was interested in. He graduates in 57. There's the two brothers, though, summer of 51. Now, the summer of 52 brings the new girlfriend into the picture, Marianne Verani. And she was sufficiently certain, I guess, of the relationship that they came up for a weekend, a Waubashene weekend in 1952. There's a close-up of them. So at this point, he was just 21, finished second year university. And Marianne Verani is 20 years old. She was born in 32. But she'd also just finished her second year university, and they're up for a Waubashene weekend. They both attend U of T Victoria College. Apparently a mutual friend of theirs, an Olympic shot putter woman, thinks they would make a great couple and invites them both to a party and pushes them together, and indeed they were. Now, Marianne had only arrived in Canada 2 years earlier in 1950 as a so-called DP, as a displaced person from Hungary. She studied very hard in the winter, spring, summer 1950, doing prep courses, university preparatory courses. And she had a lot of catching up to do because of the war and various illnesses as a child. She had not done very much schooling at all up to that point, and her English was a bit shaky as well. So she put in an amazing year of work, helped by our good friends Tiddy and Ernest Neubauer in Hamilton. And anyways, she got through all of that, and she got admitted to first year University of Toronto in September 1950. Now, I'll do a whole separate episode on the Varani family history and my mom's journey to get to Canada, which was quite a tale as well. I do know Marianne, my mom, told me about breakfast at Waubashene. Of course, she was a European girl. She was used to a coffee and maybe a croissant at breakfast with a bit of jam. And at Waubashene, apparently Jock had this giant frying pan that they'd cook outside on the barbecue. And they basically put a fire on and put the pan there, a giant pan, and put flapjacks onto that pan, and really big ones, and bacon and sausages and the whole lot as well. So she was pretty impressed by breakfast. Not sure in an entirely good way, but impressive nonetheless. So back to Doug and Marianne. Here they are on that weekend visit up to Waubashene in the very daring bikini bathing suit of the time. My dad intent on taking a photo of Mom. There he is, the shutterbug. And there's my mom swimming. She was always an excellent swimmer, and she's displaying good form with her front crawl. Lovely photograph of visiting the in-laws, I suppose, meeting the future in-laws. That's Clara Varani on the far right, Phyllis next to her, Marianne standing, Doug next to her, and Papa seated. I cannot make out that expression on my mom or my grandmother for that reason. Dad looked like he's the cat who ate the canary. There they are, I think on the same occasion. I think they really enjoyed one another's company, obviously. And here's my mom graduation day, June 1953, outside. This is Convocation Hall at the University of Toronto. That's her with the funny square hat. She graduates with a 3-year degree in geography, and she heads off to Teachers College to get her teaching certification. And on the right there, that's Marianne. On the left with the flowers, Doug and Tiddy. Well, and of course, my mom and dad were a bit unconventional. They moved in together in an apartment on Huron Street. I believe they were engaged but not yet married at this point. That might have been a bit scandalous at the time to live together in an unwed state. But that's labeled by my dad as the Huron Street apartment. He's not sure if it was 53 or 54 that photo was taken. And but they soon get married. They marry September 19th, 1953 at Hart House Chapel at the University of Toronto. There's the wedding invitation on the left and the marriage certificate on the right. There they are signing the various official documents. There they are. The best man was Uncle Mal at the wedding. And there's Mal, Marianne, and Douglas. A very unconventional wedding dress, as you can see, not the virginal white. Mom always did things her own way. And there they are afterwards at the party. I'm not exactly sure who all of these people are, but I'm guessing this is Uncle Paul, who lived in the States at the time, who was Marianne's father's brother. That's Clara, Marianne's mother, Marianne there and Douglas. That could be Wayne there. I'm not 100% sure. There they are at Christmas at 214 Cranbrook. I'm not sure who the kid is. And in September of 1954, Douglas graduates from U of T with honors BA in physiology and biochemistry. That's his graduation photo. He begins work as a control chemist with General Mills Canada. At the same time, though, he also begins pursuing a career in writing, in fiction writing, hoping to be able to jump over into that at some point. And so there's a whole collection of his writings that we have still. In those days, you would write out your work by hand, and as you can see, you'd go and you make some corrections and cross it out, and if there were too many of those, you'd rewrite it all by hand, and you'd maybe reread it and do a few more corrections, and then you'd get it typed up. Now, Marianne knew how to touch type, so she would type them up very quickly, and he'd revise them, and then she'd retype, and then they'd submit them for publication. So here's one story called April's Fool, for instance. So you can see over there in the top right, this is where he submitted it to Family Circle, Maclean's, Playboy even, Canadian Home Journal, Star Weekly. And there's a lot of rejections in this business. You get a lot of rejections, and most of them are just form rejections. Thank you for submitting the enclosed material. We regret that is not quite suitable for our purpose. So most of those that's the life of a writer, I think. He occasionally got something that actually had some substance. So, dear Mr. Penny, thank you for letting us have a look at April's Fool. I enjoyed this story, although it didn't make a place on our fiction list. The theme of the little man who escapes from his wife and his deadly everyday routine is one that has been used a little often in fiction. But I thought your treatment was appealing without being sentimental. The use of familiar scenes and place names helps the story too, I thought. I shall certainly be looking forward to seeing more of your work soon. That was Feb 15th, 1954. So he was already submitting to publication as early as 1954. There they are, the chemist and writer and the teacher. Christmas 1954, Doug, Marianne, and Phyllis with the mandatory funny hats. And there's that same Christmas, there's Jock with his dog Jip. There's Phyllis and Jock up at Wilcox Lake. I think I recognize that fur coat as one that Ann had before, so I guess Jock passed it on to Phyllis. And there's a picture of Marianne and Doug on April 2nd, 1955, is written on the back of it. So at this point, Marianne is a teacher, and Doug works as a chemist, as I said, an aspiring writer. And my mom tells a story that at one point told to teach the science class. Now, she was really good with geography and history, both of which she had studied and she really knew a lot about from just her general education as well. But she was suddenly drafted into teaching a science class. And she didn't know what she was doing in science at all. But of course, my dad was a great scientist, an amateur scientist through high school and studied science at university and working as a professional scientist as well. So every day before class, he would coach her on an experiment to do, what to do and what to teach. And my mom, though, recalls one case where she wasn't listening appropriately. And Dad said to demonstrate how magnesium, how it reacts with air when subject to heat and creates a huge fizz of light and smoke. And he said, don't take more than an inch. Marianne was a bit distracted, and when she later got the stuff, it came in rolls and an inch. So she took a section of the roll that was about an inch thick, which was, of course, a tremendous amount of magnesium. Dad meant, unroll it and take 1 inch. Anyway, she lit that on fire. And apparently there was an amazing explosion. No one got injured, but there were some questions that needed to be answered. And apparently after the excitement, the next class came in, and the one of the boys asked, "Oh, Mrs. Penny, can we have an explosion like the last class?" There they are in 1955. I think that's Marianne singing, I think. In July of 55, Allan and Phyllis, they purchased land on Leonard Lake in Muskoka and put the Waubashene cottage up for sale at the end of the season. Papa always said that Waubashene was getting overrun. It was getting too crowded, too many tourists around. And they had extended the highways up further north at that point. And so they wanted to get away from it all up to Leonard Lake. So here they are with Mal reconnoitering. Mal would always use the word reconnoitering from his military days, I guess. And I think they had just bought the property, and they were up for the visit. And that's Phyllis in front of their family car at the time. I don't know if that's Mal's car or Allan's. In 1955, in July, Wayne gets married to Auntie Cynthia Louise Scrimmager. So Wayne had just finished his second year of university. So they marry on July 30th, 1955, and they have their first daughter, Susan, over here in that family picture, if you recall from episode 1, on March of 1956. So yeah, a bit rushed, but they got it done in time for sure. Wayne graduates in 1957, and he goes on to an absolutely brilliant career. He's one of the leading premier Canadian tax accountants at the firm of Clarkson and Gordon. I know he was in Toronto for quite a time, and then he was in Ottawa for a time after that. In Toronto, they actually lived just the same block on the street where my family was. 57, Jennifer is born, and then in 58, Stuart is born, and then in 61, Deborah is born, with my sister being born between Stuart and Debbie, that's L'Oreal, and me, David, born in 62. Now, I imagine there was some angst around that marriage. My dad, of course, who was writing, he wrote a story that was undoubtedly inspired by those events called A Wedding in the Family. Now, this is a fictional story, but these are some thoughts that my dad put down. I'll read the story to you. It's fairly short. I think it's only 6-7 pages. Breakfast that morning was a cheerless affair. The three of them ate in silence. There was nothing to say. Things had been stormy and tearful the night before, and every night since he had told them. But now, in the grey morning, over eggs and toast, there was nothing more to say. Once his mother looked up and squeezed his arm for a second. Her eyes were moist, and he longed to melt, to let his own eyes filled with tears, to feel sorry for what had happened, to bury his face in her lap, to be forgiven, and to feel the warm, compassionate mother love flowing out to him again. But he could not. The muscles in his arm tightened, and he winced inwardly as he felt the nervous withdrawal of her hand. Until now, he had never realized the cruelty implicit in being yourself. He wanted desperately to end the cruelty, to yield and let his mother's hand sink slowly into his arm. But deeper still, he knew that it could only be a temporary surrender, and that the escape, when inevitably it came, could only be more cruel still. He watched as his father gravely buttered a piece of toast. The butter was carefully replaced in the center of the table, something his father seldom remembered to do. How it must hurt, he thought, if his father did not even want to hear his voice asking for the butter. How strange that something he had done so easily and so naturally should seem to them the end of their world. He too reached for the butter and spread his toast, softening as well as he could the rasping of the knife on the crisp bread. He too returned the butter to the center of the table. Why, he wondered, did he not want to hear their voices? Perhaps because the sound of their voices called back the whole order of things that had been. He had never wanted to destroy that order, to break it or harm it in any way, but nevertheless he had awakened one morning to find it irretrievably smashed. The breakfast slowly finished as it had started, in silence. His mother quietly stacked the dishes together, carried them to the sink, and ran the water until it was hot. His father fetched his old coat, then went out to the garage to check the oil and water and tire pressures on the car. Ingleton was only 80 miles away, but his father was never comfortable unless he had done these things before he left. He picked up a towel and helped his mother dry the dishes. There were not many, and they had soon finished. He spread his towel on the rack and went to his room for a tie and his jacket, while his mother added a last puff of powder to her makeup and adjusted her hat. He heard the car being backed out of the driveway, and a moment later his father coming in the front door and ratting among the hangers in the front closet as he hung up the old coat and slipped into the new one he had bought last winter. The drive to Ingleton was as silent as breakfast had been, except that now their intent absorption in the countryside through which they passed seemed to offer some excuse for not talking. The sky was gray, with here and there pale streaks of blue. The fields were brown and solidly earthy, the way fields can only become in the late fall. A few yellow leaves still flattered in the woodlot, but everywhere the strong black skeletons of the trees were emerging and reaching up to scrub the sky like a piece of steel wool. They all three sat in the front seat, he beside the door. His father had always been a cautious driver, but today he seemed troubled and preoccupied, driving slowly along, scarcely touching 40 on the empty highway. Only once in the long morning had he broken the silence. "I've worked hard all my life," he said. "I've been steady and reliable and a good provider for all of you. I've always paid my debts, and I hope I always will, and I've raised my children as well as I could." That was all that was said. It was as if from a mystic silence in the deep heart of some great Gothic cathedral a voice had suddenly read out the credo. He had heard his father's credo as distinctly as it would ever be told. His father's life had been guided on those principles, and he began to understand how difficult it was for his father to understand how it had all happened and why. Shortly after 12, they pulled up in front of the Williamsons' house. Ingleton was a county seat, a small town of civil servants and retired farmers. Its tree-lined streets were quiet and gentle, and the Williamsons, like all the others, was a solid red brick two-story house with a steeply pitched gabled roof. It was sturdy and respectable, and he thought it a little incredible, as his parents climbed stiffly out of the car and stretched their legs, that a girl like Jean could have been born and brought up in a town like this. For a moment his father busied himself around the car, locking doors and making sure he was well clear of the driveway. Then he preceded them awkwardly down the walk and raised the knocker on the big green door, a knocker heavily encrusted with paint, so that when it fell the sound was hollow and muffled. Mrs. Williamson answered the door. She was a woman of his mother's age, a little taller, her features a little more angular. She wore a plain brown dress, and she reached out and took his mother's hand firmly. Mr. Williamson was older than he had expected. His hair was almost white, and he wore an old, softly comfortable blue serge suit and a modest tie. His manner was gentle, a little hesitant, and he took their coats and hung them one by one on the hall stand. As Mrs. Williamson led the way into the front room, he felt a hand on his, and he turned and found Jean beside him. It was hard to believe that this slim, pale, frightened little girl in the gray skirt and high-neck blouse, who clung so desperately to his hand, was the gay, vivacious Jean he had known in Toronto, the light-hearted, devil-may-care girl he had fallen so much in love with, and yet it was reassuring to know this side of her as well. He put his arm around her waist and pulled her gently towards him. They looked at each other, smiled faintly, and then turned and walked slowly into the front room. Because his father had driven so slowly, they were a little later than expected, so they sat down almost immediately to their supper of roast beef, potatoes, peas, and carrots, with pumpkin pie on the sideboard for dessert. The conversation throughout the meal was quiet and subdued, confined almost solely to the older people and running predictably through all the conventional conversational openings. After dinner, Jean helped her mother stack the plates and then led him upstairs to the sun porch above the kitchen, which was their living room on less formal occasions. Both men smoked pipes, and after exchanging pouches, they returned to the front room and settled down for a quiet after-dinner smoke. The two women slipped back to the kitchen and began the washing up. At first they talked about the life in Ingleton and the little improvements Mrs. Williamson hoped to make around her rather old-fashioned kitchen. But these topics were soon exhausted, and there followed a long period of silence, with only the swirl of the dish rag in the water and the sound of plates being slid together. At last Mrs. Williamson turned and looked at her companion. "I suppose you are very disappointed in our children," she said slowly and hesitantly. The boy's mother replied equally slowly, "It's just that you hope, when it comes time for your children to marry, that it won't be under circumstances like this." Then both women turned back to the dishes. But slowly, from the corners of their eyes, the tears rolled out until, with almost one accord, they again turned and fumbled for their handkerchiefs. As the two women looked at each other with misty eyes, Mrs. Williamson began to laugh. I don't know why we're crying," she said, through the strange, disturbing mixture of tears and laughter. "After all, there is going to be a wedding in the family." Well, there you have it. I guess my dad was inspired, I suppose, by real-life events, but again, we don't know how much of that is fiction and pure fiction and how much is inspired by actual events. But he was obviously affected by the event. Well, there they are, Marianne and Douglas, on an excursion to Point Severn across the bay from Waubashene. This is in 1955, August 15th. Mal is taking the photo. Well, there's the three of them going for a swim. Marianne looking appreciatively at Doug. I think they enjoy each other. There's Uncle Mal, I think, sucking in his stomach a little bit, as we do. There's Doug and Marianne swimming near the waterfall at Point Severn. Well, and here the family is closing up the Waubashene cottage for the last time. Allan fitting the storm door to the back door. That's September 1955. There's Mel closing up the Waubashene cottage, sitting on the front steps. And there it is, all closed up, waiting for the next owners. So that cottage was from 1934 to 1955. That spanned about 20 years. All through Mal's, Doug's, and Wayne's childhood. That was the family cottage, not Leonard Lake, as our next generation came to know. Well, construction begins on the Leonard Lake cottage in May of 1956, and this photo was taken September 1956. So they made quick work of putting up the very first Leonard Lake cottage. Well, they were professional carpenters in the family, after all. And there's Papa looking on proudly at the Leonard Lake cottage. So I think we'll end it there. Both boys, Douglas and Wayne, are now happily married. The war long over. The Waubashene cottage now gone as well. In the next episode, I'll take a brief detour and I'll go into my mother's very interesting life leading up to her arrival in Toronto. And then the episode after that, we'll take back up where we left off on the Penny family history. So once again, a toast to the Penny family and the Penny family history slideshow. Cheers. Until next time.